All right, guys, welcome. Thank you for coming to Quemoción's very first Cafecito. This is our ongoing series of various topics and hot button issues that affect people in our community, Latine, Latinx, Latina, Latino creators. Tonight's topic is Latinx versus Latino versus Latine. What in the world are we supposed to call ourselves? And how do we feel about it? How has this Pandora's box, or maybe not a Pandora's box, been affecting all of us in how we navigate, how we speak to each other, and how we talk about ourselves and how we express ourselves?
Well, everybody, as you know, this is a very complex and some might say controversial topic. And I feel it's really important to go over some large-ish context of the history of the term so that we know what we're dealing with, okay? So we're talking about whether to use Latino, Latina, Latinx, even Latine, a more recent option, when talking generally about the Latin American community, and in an inclusive way, of course. As we know, Spanish language is gendered, which means nouns ending in an A as perceived as feminine and nouns ending with an O as perceived as masculine, right? But also, this makes Latino a male term, theoretically, right? But also in Spanish, Latino is considered to be an inclusive term no matter what your gender are. Just nouns ending in O are also the default for all inclusiveness, no matter what your gender is. Like we can say the word human, right? Humanos. Like if you say humanos, your mind is at least supposed to go to the concept of humans and not a particular face or gender or race, right? However, this aspect of Spanish is often criticism because it's sexist, because male nouns take over female nouns. Like I'll give you an example. You could have a group of 6 Latinas and a Latino comes in, and after that you're supposed to call the group Latinos, right? So that's how it takes over. And some people say, let's revert that. If there's 7 Latinas and 1 Latino, let's call the group Latinas. But that just doesn't seem inclusive enough, because that's just resting in the gender binary of male, female too, right? So where does that leave people who fall outside the woman-man binary, like people who are agender, non-binary, gender fluid, among other identities? Now, in the past, their efforts, the gender binary in Spanish have included, and let me know, raise your hand if you've used this before, Latino/A, or Latin at, the one we would use for email addresses. I know I used that for a number of years. But again, binary, right? Because the at is supposed to be the A circled by an O. So that was the logic behind that, but still, that rests in the binary. So enter Latinx, on the other hand, which is a term that's free of gender, right? And that's why it's been embraced by the trans community, the non-binary community, amongst many others. Latin Americans are the largest minority group in the country. They're mark nearly a fifth of Americans. 17.4% of the total US population are Latin Americans. Now, out of this number, 1.4 million identify as LGBTQ+. And at 6.1%, Hispanics continue to be the single ethnic group most likely to identify as LGBTQ+, out of all the ethnicities in the US. So this is why we're seeing the relevance of this conversation and why we need to have it. So now for a second, let's break Latinx. It's unclear how it started. We just know it started to be kind of hip and it started to trend early 2000s, but nobody knows exactly when it started. Now, why the X? There are several theories. It could be influenced by feminist movements in the 70s to the 90s in Latin America, where feminists used to draw an X on top of words that ended on OS, marking that the male shouldn't be the default. It could also be influenced by the civil rights movements in the US, like Malcolm X used the X to deny his slave name, right? And we also know that in math, X is a variable and something like it's unknown. So, and in this case, it's used to connote unspecified gendered. Now, why do we use Latinx? Why is it catching up? It's the same reason why we say postal worker instead of mailman, or we don't use the word stewardess anymore, right? It's like plane attendant. To make it accessible to all genders, to make it genderless, to give everybody an equal shot at the job, and to also include people who don't identify within the binary as well. It's similar to what we're seeing with pronouns, right? more and more so, we're being encouraged to say our pronouns and don't assume everybody else's, right? So there's a parallel here going on. But here comes the criticism, and we're getting close to opening the conversation. How the heck do you say Latinx? Especially if English isn't your first language. In Spanish, X can sound like an S, like an H, like a J, the list goes on. Some people say Latinx, some people say Latinx. So, and how the heck do you insert a bunch of X in a casual conversation? For example, say you want to say the beautiful Latin Americans. In Spanish, it would be the default, the male would be los Latinos bonitos. You would have to say los Latinos bonitos, which I admit already sounds like a different language. And for me, who Spanish is my first language, it feels like a different language already. So you got one term that's gender neutral, but the rest of Spanish conjugation isn't. So what do you do with that? Just so you know, the word has been officially added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary in 2018 and is defined as a gender neutral term for Latin Americans. But the Royal Academy of Spanish, which is the institution of maintaining the consistency of Spanish language, refuses to include any use of X or the E. They insist, mark these words, there is no connection between grammatical gender and gender oppression. And the fact that this term is most championed by Latin Americans living in the United States has also faced some pushback. Some say Latinx carried the added whiff of imperialism and that it's an arrogant supposition that Latin Americans needed US Latin folks to teach them that Spanish has sexist elements, and an attempt to force American ideals onto people living in Latin America. Now, purists argue that the word is only about political correctness and that the word, listen to this, will destroy Spanish. You heard that correctly. But as some other people put it, Spanish language has already evolved tremendously over the past 500 years and can withstand more. Let's open this conversation with 3 questions, and whoever, let the question that resonates the most start you, and you do the emoji. Do we try to stick to neutralizing words that refer to people, or do nouns and conjugations in general should change? If it was created by queer Latinx people in the US and is difficult to pronounce for people living in Latin America, should it not only be used in the US? Also, why not use Latin American? Is there a connection between grammatical gender and gender oppression? Go.
So just very quickly, we're going to go around the horn here. We have Jade, who is Jade Rain Vega, the actor. Jade Rain, the actor. Great. We have Kelmy Bermudez, who is also an actor. And we have Regina Romero, who is an actress and writer. We have Woe, who is an actor, writer, and musician. We have Melissa, who is a performer and writer, Melissa Marie Brown. We have Jasmine, who is an actor, writer, and teaching artist. And we have the incomparable G.V. Maldonado, who is a puppeteer, stage manager, and teaching artist. This is a space where you can say, I don't know. You can say, oh, I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me. You can say, I respect your point, but I disagree. You can be clear and firm about the point you are trying to make without hurting anyone else's feelings as well. So just letting you know, this is a safe space. You can mess up words, you can mess up your connections. We encourage mistakes in a manner of speaking because that's the only way that you grow. So the more the merrier. This is not about who's right, who's wrong. We just want to have a conversation. And that's all I'll say.
I feel that I'm also an immigrant in the United States. I am from Mexico. My first language is Spanish. And I was introduced to the term Latinx in the United States. I had never before heard it in Mexico. I had heard other attempts of making gender neutral language as Latinat, Latinus. I had heard even like I used it pretty often. I would say amishes, because in Mexico there is this beautiful, beautiful group of people who are los Muxes, which they are from the region of Oaxaca. Um, and Muxes are non-binary um, people um, from part of our, indigenous population that since before they were colonized, they they recognized as part of the population because they were born with the two spirits and with the two energies, both male, well, not male, masculine and feminine energies. So for me to hear Latinx was a little bit like, oh, but then it got popular more in the States, and I also started living in the States. So for me now, it's more of a code switching. So if I'm like in Mexico, I will say Latines because for me it's just easier to pronounce. Like Federico said, it's really weird going Latinx, Latinx, and like he said, we pronounce the X in 5 different ways. So I think also what I've seen, and this is purely from the feminist movement happening in Mexico, um, because I am very passionate about language. And I remember that one of the most amazing like classes we had in college was linguistics, and it was semantics. And in semantics, you are told that there's three components to a word. And it's the sound, um, which, you know, everybody knows, like if I said word, that's the sound. There's the graphic side, and then there's the meaning. And the meaning is interpreted by everybody differently. And there's basically that there's these two elements in which if you were said a word, you can interpret it like the general social acceptance of the word. Like nobody's going to picture a tree when you say the word chair. Everybody's going to think of a chair, but everybody's going to see a different chair in their head. With this, I think that if you say Latinx, um, we're all going to think about Latin Americans, but it's going to be a different concept. So if you say the word Latinx to a Latin American, like person that lives in Latin America, they're gonna understand it as a term that wasn't born in their continent, or well, not continent, but region, because continent is like all of America. And I also think that it's very important that like language is what society makes of it. And that is the power of language. If we want to change something, if we want to make it inclusive, it's not up to the Royal Academy. I'm sorry. It's up to us because we're the users of the language and the users define it.
I wanted to, continue your line of conversation. It is important to know, and I think between these three questions, to identify that this started in the U.S. region, and Latinos are, how do you say this? It's a group. However, we are so different in so many ways. But like you mentioned, Regina, it's very difficult for somebody that is not using that specific language to start using Latinx or Latin, because, for example, I'm only speaking from my experience, is that I'm Puerto Rican. We don't deserve, we don't call ourselves Latinx or Latino. We are above all Puerto Ricans. And then when you move and migrate to the United States, you are aware that you belong to this group, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess I'm Latino. Yes, because we have a lot of heritage that unifies us, but we are so different. So it is very hard for that terminology to travel back to any region, Latin America or the Caribbean, because you cannot make people, call themselves something that they just learn. And I understand the importance of, yes, it started within the United States and it slowly travels. Saying that, I want also say that in the artist community in Puerto Rico, it is now, I want to call it common, that we are calling ourselves todes, artistes, and that is, it shows more advanced, artists. We are um, sin equivocación, we are more advanced than the rest. We understand the world differently. And it's very important when we're talking about terminology, if a specific group wants to call themselves in any way, we should respect that. And like we established at the beginning of this conversation, I am still getting used to the pronouns thing, but I think it's so necessary, especially when we speak many languages. When you learn a language in such a way, and it's your second or third language, and then that language starts switching live, it's like, wait, there's no gender in English, and now I gotta switch. It's harder for us to be more inclusive, at least for me. It's harder to be more inclusive when speaking, and writing is something different. Writing can hold so many things, and it's so powerful. Whereas when we're speaking to each other, I like to, like Alexandra did at the beginning, like, how do you want to be called? And I'll call you whatever you want. I don't want to make assumptions about you by the way you look. I don't want to assume you're Latino or Latina or Latine because you look in a specific way. So yeah, I want to make emphasis on that it started in the United States, and it's an experience of people that are born and raised in the United States with a Latino heritage, and not necessarily from other places and regions. Somebody can take over.
I'm just going to throw into more data that has to do with, Kelmi, what you said, and Regina, what you said. Only 3% of Latinos use Latinx. What's more, almost 3 out of 4 of those same adults had never even heard the term. And Kelmi, some still reject Latino, like you said. And like in the 90s, for instance, there was a popular bumper sticker, "Don't call me Hispanic, I'm Cuban," which is people frustrated that think that people think of Latinos as it's all the same thing, right? We do share, like you said, there is a shared background. And I think in a lot of ways, politically even, it's important to band together because we do understand a lot of our same socio-political contexts. But anyway, I just wanted to say those two things.
Okay, hey, so to further add to the conversation, I'm just going to start with the fact that I consider myself Spanglish because I grew up in New York, so I'm New Yorican. So, so Puerto Riqueña, pero, like you said, is different from the States versus growing up on the island. So instantly based off that, even growing up here, I never heard the term Latinx until like a few years ago. And the show, One Day at a Time, if you guys have seen that show before, that's really what started kind of getting me into understanding where that term came from and everything, because the daughter in the show was so like going so hard about the differences. And I'm someone who's bisexual myself as well, so I am in that LGBTQ community, and I understand everything when it comes to the pronouns. But even then, like, this is still something I'm consistently learning. Like, this is a whole process, so for the first thing when it comes to using that term, it feels uncomfortable for me myself instantly, because I've like always been trying so hard to even be fluent in Spanish now, the way that it is. So it's like, considering the fact that, we could change the whole language is a huge thing that Fede brought up for me, which is something I feel like is going to happen if this does get adopted everywhere. And it's not that that's not something that's okay. Like, we have our own different colloquialisms that we use, certain things I might say here in America, even other Latinos, let's say, might not understand it because it's certain like, slang languages that we've adopted to as well. Like, I'm from Brooklyn. Certain things I've said, even at Teatro Sea, which is where I met Fede, people are like, what are you talking about? And it's something like everybody has a different language, even in this. Like, my Puerto Rican Spanglish is still different from many of my Dominican friends, my Mexican friends. There's so many different terms, regardless of even this main umbrella of Spanish. We have the proper Spain Spanish. Like, what even is the proper Spanish at this point? So I'm inclusive to it. I appreciate the inclusivity that it's bringing, but I understand why only 3% of people are using it, and how older generations are like, ¿qué es eso de Latinx? Like, like they don't understand it either. And I feel like it's something that's going to take a lot of time to really incorporate, throughout all of Latin America. Like here in America, we're consistently changing things. And like, you know, we like to say it's a free nation and this and that, but it does kind of feel that way because there's always something else that gets added into this pot and we just kind of go with the flow of it. But I can't say that we can like, it feels like we're trying to force it kind of upon people at this point, like the older generations at least. And like a lot of people just aren't even open to changing their views at this point. Like I still argue to this day with my grandmother about even my own sexuality. Like it's just something that's so far fetched for them that I can understand why they hold on so like tightly to the language at the very least, because to them it seems like we're trying to change the culture, you know, of the whole thing that we've been indoctrinated into throughout our lives at this point. So I'm open to it. It's definitely something that I'm still trying to understand myself when it comes to using that, because like you said, it's like, are we going to do it specifically just for these gender terms, or is it literally going to be every single word now in the entire language? What does this mean for everybody else? You know, so I agree with Regina when she said like we can't say like, hey, the congregation or whoever it is going to tell us what we can and can't do. Understand that part, but I also don't think it's fair for us as the Americans who like adopted this term to be like, oh, now all Latinos have to use it because you have to understand everything with this. And you know, we're trying to change the world, which is true. You know, we're doing it generation by generation, but I can't say that, you know, this is going to happen overnight. So it's something that I think everybody has to have compassion with and be a little patient, especially with those who are older than us and even certain people that are younger than us that haven't even learned certain things with their culture or with this language, because I'm still learning different Spanish words every day and I'm 27 years old. You know, so I can't expect my younger 10-year-old cousin who might understand Latinx better to really fully understand what like putting all of these terms into the language or changing certain things means for the other people that are going to feel so affected by it. That's just my portion I have to add right now.
So, fellow New Yorican in the house, and the thing learning Spanish, and like I like to say, like the Queen's Spanish has been the uphill struggle of my life. And so this term of Latinx, you know, I heard it on the subway like in 2016, and it was a thing. It was always seemed like it was something that was like people always look down upon, like, oh, that's something that they made up. But I'm fine with this. And let me tell you why I am fine with this. Because one, I'm going to agree with Regina, with Kelmy, and with Jade that we are coming in and this is an American experience. Yeah, I'm American, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm super American. But when we have like, oh my God, I lost my point, faded away from me. Son of a gun. Pass, son of a gun. I'll come back to me, son of a gun.
Right, you have it. It's right there.
Let me drink my coffee.
You have this for you always. All right, well, let's go to you.
I'm so sorry.
So yeah, thank you guys for all of the amazingly well thought out points. I love this conversation. I am half Black and half Mexican. I grew up here in the US, in Houston, Texas. So yeah, I just want to say I love this conversation because like Jade was saying, you know, it basically like shows the fissure around like these issues. So like when you talk about the term and try to convert people to using the term, you're essentially doing the work of advocacy by like asking them to buy into like understanding non-binary people and understanding queer people. So like the resistance to the term is actually the resistance to the people that it represents at the same time. And that's it.
Yes, that's the point I was getting at. Okay, so like, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Boricua. I don't even go to this Latino thing because we don't speak Latin. I don't speak Latin. I don't come from Hispaniola. I'm going to talk about Hispanics. Hispanics are Dominicans and Haitians from the island of Hispaniola. I don't mess with Spain. I don't like Spain. I've been conquered by Spain. My people have been raped by Spain. I don't mess with Spain. And so I don't care what the Royal Academy of Spanish says. Burn it all down. Burn it all down, because the language has been oppressing us forever. And to say that like, oh, this should only be like an American dialect. Maybe it could be an American dialect. Maybe it is a slang for us. But I don't even identify, like, do I even identify as Latino? People call me Latina. I gotta wear the hoops, but I'm Bori. And it just seems like these are boxes that people are trying to put us in all the time. They just want to put us in these little boxes, the O, the A, the X, the E. I just want to be all together. Yeah, we speak Spanish, but you know, we have those towns in Mexico. We have the Two-Spirit people all across the world. We have you know, Arawak people. You know, we come from Arawak people too in the Caribbean. And like trying to reclaim that language is a struggle as well. So it's all just, to me, it's not, it's like, it's a thing that people are just kind of fighting amongst themselves. I'll go with wherever you guys call me, and wherever I think that it's also what Regina said about the glyph, the symbol. What I see, when I see myself, that's when I'll recognize that we're talking about me. And that's my instance with this subject. I kind of like, my resistance is like, just burn the whole thing down. Spanish, Spain, I don't care. I don't speak Latin. We should all speak Latin though. Everybody should learn to speak Latin though. Because we gotta, like, you know, all the languages are coming together nowadays in a global world. We need to be able to speak multiple languages.
Like, I'm just like caught between like wishing that there was some sort of powers that be or authority. GV, you're so good. Like someone who would be like, okay, it's Latine, like colorín colorado, and then we would all get our shit together, and then our parents, our grandparents, the world at large would be able to sort of take this more seriously. And because I do think it gets dismissed as like, because that thing does exist of like, I'm seeing it, you know, I'm like a pinko commie liberal Democrat, you know, like, but I see it amongst my friend groups where it's like, I don't feel like we're attacking the actual issues at hand. We're just getting caught up in the syntax, and we're just getting caught up in the virtue signaling and in the, you know, posturing of being progressive, while not really enacting any change at all. We're just using the vocabulary because it's trendy. And that to me feels at times very dangerous, very like there's all of this posturing going on and all of this energy being spent on the syntax and on the trendy words. And I'm like, where's that energy being used to enact actual change, like with policy and the way we treat each other, and you know, and the way these groups get represented. So it's like this rock and a hard place that, you know, I certainly think about every day and am negotiating every day. But I just wanted to share that with you guys. And then, yeah, great. So we've got Regina, Woe, Jasmine, and then Liz. Cool. So I'll toss it over to Regina.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you said, because I think that is what I was trying to mention with the feminist movement in all of Latin America, the uprisings that have been happening, is because like it goes beyond language. Our fight as women, as LGBTQ, is way beyond language. I mean, it's nice to be acknowledged, you know, that is always going to be nice. It's nice that people are trying to recognize that, like, you know, there are trans people, there are non-binary people. We have to include them in these conversations. We have to like make space for them too. But the thing is that like it doesn't matter what we call ourselves if we're not doing something about it, if we're not being protected. Because in Latin America, women and LGBTQ peeps are the most mistreated minorities. They don't care about us dying. They don't care about us suffering. So for me, I agree a lot with what GV is saying. If it doesn't come from action, I don't care what you're gonna call me, because in the end, it doesn't matter. And I think that also, like, I agree with the point that it is a whole different experience receiving the term Latino or Latinx or Latina, because I do think that, like, it's really nice to confront your identity, in terms of, like, where you're coming from, because, like, usually in Mexico, everybody's like, oh, we're just like all mixed. We are all, like, from different backgrounds, blah blah blah. And the conversations on identity with Latinidad, and with just, like, how much part of, like, how Spain colonized most of Latin America, but then we forget completely about Brazil or Guyana, or all these other islands that, Haiti, and we just exclude them if we focus on just, like, the semantics of Spanish, or if we just focus on, like, what is comfortable for a language. So yeah, identity is really important. And I think we need to integrate language that makes everyone comfortable, but we also need to act on it.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to the point that Latino, Latina, Latinx, like, this term mostly came about, like, in the US as a kind of coalition term for people from all different Latin American countries in the US to band together and fight for rights and talk about, like, oppression that was happening. So I think, like, if the whole point of the term is to be inclusive of multiple groups, then I think it should be Latinx, because that is more inclusive than Latino or So
Hey, so first, just really quick to speak to something that GV said. We all use a Taino word in regular conversation all the time. It's hurricane. Love it. Just want to make sure everybody understands that we use these traditional words. I'm mixed race, so I, like, don't even bother at this point, because there's so much complications with being mixed race at this. Like, I don't need to fight you about how Hispanic or Latina I am. I'm Phil Rican, hashtag Bruno Mars. That's what I'm gonna do, because I don't want to, it's too much work. But for me, it feels like one of those things that's, like, lost in translation. I feel like we're using this X in English because it's what we use for other things. It's what I use for folks. It's what I use for multiple other words. But, like, if that's not going to fit into the way that the Spanish language is built, then of course, like, we shouldn't use the X then. Like, I'm using, like, it's literally just, like, that's the translation of the inclusive term. Like, the inclusive term can be something else if it doesn't work. Like, that's just a translation. And so, like, trying to figure out what is appropriate and inclusive, but then ultimately, to speak to what other people have said, I kind of ultimately, this will sound terrible, I ultimately, like, don't care about the language, because we haven't figured out how to be equal yet. And so I'm, like, not worried about what you want to say, because that seems entirely secondary to actual equality. And, like, it's just exhausting.
Hey, so I was just gonna go off of what Alex had said earlier. So I know that there's, like, a lot of virtue signaling, especially, like, within our generation. But I think that language is very powerful, and that's, like, one of the reasons that we even have these meetings to talk to each other about, how we use these terms in our everyday lives. I think Jasmine's point is really solid, because there is a way to incorporate it that doesn't have to be so American. I think Latinx is a little bit easier to incorporate into the language that is already there. It's the least amount of change for like the older generation, but it still is inclusive and progressive. And I think that language should always be progressive to include everybody and make everybody feel like they're heard and have a voice.
So yes, to further add on to that as well, same with Liz and Jasmine and GV. I feel like it does need to have that inclusivity. I do agree that Latinx definitely sounds a little bit easier for everybody. But on top of that too, myself, my opinion, I feel like it can just essentially end up just being an inclusive term added onto the language. I don't think it has to be a complete erasure of the Latino, Latina, narrative. Like we all have our own pronouns that we've announced here, where it's okay, we prefer she, they, we prefer she, her, him, them. We're not forcing they, them on everyone to be inclusive. So I don't think we need to force essentially Latinx or Latinx on everyone to be inclusive in that way. We still have our own identity. And if you want to still call yourself Latina, go ahead. If you want to call yourself Latino, go ahead. If you simply want to identify as Latinx, that's fine as well. I don't think it needs to be anything too specific to that. And also, yes, the language in itself doesn't change all of the other issues within our culture as it is. When it comes to the misogyny that still is so deeply in the whole masculine community. When it comes to, the feminine, oh, you have to cook and do this. The fact that my grandmother's still telling me, when's my grandkid coming? Like all of these things that are so further deeply down in our culture that have nothing to do with the language in itself. And that's something that happens across the board of all Latinos. Or excuse me, Latinas, Latinx, everybody, Latinas, all of these things. So yes, there's many issues. That's even in America in itself. Everything has to do with progressiveness at this time, progression. So that's just something I feel like that needs to be considered. And when it comes to, using the X in the language, like, yes, if it's too complicated, there can be another term. Like this is not the end all be all, caso cerrado term that needs to be used. So I think that's something else to bring to the table too, is like, what is something that all Latins, Latin Americans, or Latins in general are, that something's going to be able to, like, for them to take? Let's have a conversation with everyone if that's the case. Why does the X bother them so much specifically? Like what would make them then feel like this is inclusive but also not erasing them or the things that they grew up in and they built? Like this is something that needs to be further than just the people that are trying to indoctrinate it. So that's going to take years to happen. So it's like this shouldn't be the main question or the main argument of this whole fight that we have within our communities.
I just want to add something that has been brought up recently, and it's a question. Can language be forced artificially? First, change people's minds by integrating groups socially, and then the language. Otherwise, people aren't ready to understand it. Or does changing the language, like Liz, I think you suggested slightly, makes the process easier? Just by saying another option, it makes you ask the question and open people's minds. So that's just something, we don't have to get to that right away. But since Latine is already on the table, I just want to give viewers general context on Latine. So it comes as a third alternative, including E instead of O or an A as a neutral term. It's easier to pronounce and to apply. Bienvenidos todos would be bienvenides todes. You don't have to think about it so much if Spanish is your first language. Now, non-binary people suggest ella as a gender-neutral pronoun instead of él or ella. And some ask for its inclusion in the dictionary and in official documents, like for instance, at the doctor when you have to check a box and you're being forced to choose between the male and female binary. Now, problem, we know there's always something, right? So, like for example, the word actor or writer. It could be escritor is writer, right? It could be escritore. But the male plural version of escritor is escritores already. It's not escritoros, it's escritores. So what would be the plural of the non-binary escritore? It would be escritores. So it's just like a rabbit hole of just like so much detail. And this is a really fun one. Latina could be useful to when referring to something that's not gender, like in a novel like Robots or Aliens, for instance, that in Spanish we need to gender. Found an example that's saying that the success of the Star Wars title, The Last Jedi, is the mystery of not knowing the gender of the Jedi. Because, with the character, right? And so it's like, that's such a big part of the title in English. While in Spanish, it was El Último Jedi, making it clearly male. And here it says you could switch it to the adjective last to El Último Jedi. But you still have to worry about the article, like el ultime Jedi, what are you going to say? Ella ultime Jedi? Because ella is a pronoun, but not an article. So we have to think of articles too. So just to give some context on how detailed and complex this is. So is it too soon for ask for those implementations like people are asking in the dictionary and in forums? Is it too soon? Or what's an appropriate third option? Because are we erasing people by saying male, female, other? That seems pretty othering to me, or maybe not, but the word is other. So is that appropriate? What's another idea? I don't know. I just opened this if this brings up for anybody, but I know somebody already had done the thing. But just if any of this resonates, please bring it to the table.
Just when I thought we had the universe figured out, we have Woe, Kelmy, and Regina.
I love it. Honestly, language is about creativity. And like we've been saying, I think that people need to like create what they want to be called. And like, I don't know, if the article needs to be le or something, just like make it happen. I don't know, like get creative, make it happen, try it out. Like if it catches on, it catches on. Like that's how languages evolved in the first place. Like we all just came out of caves going like, "Ugh," and then it eventually like became a system of communication. So I like language just evolves and it's cool. But what I wanted to say was I think yes, there's like a lot of virtue signaling with using terms like Latinx, but also I pretty specifically remember when I got invited to be part of this group, it said like it's gonna be for like Latinx artists. And for me, it was a signal. It wasn't necessarily virtue signaling, but it was a signal to me that it was going to be an inclusive group for queer and non-binary people, and that I was being asked to join like a progressive group of artists in the Latinx world, and not like some group where they're gonna ask me to like perform machismo and and like on stage or something. So it's it means something to people who feel that they need to be included.
You said that, and that's amazing because if from the start you using this language and this language is understood to be automatically inclusive, that's amazing. I love that. And I wanted to add, Jade started something about not forcing something or anything. Somebody mentioned it, and yeah, you just mentioned it. Well, language is an ever evolving thing. It's a tool. It's supposed to be a tool. It's not written on stone because of something with a purpose, because it's ever evolving. And I love that Fede made a Star Wars reference, because I love Star Wars. And in Puerto Rico, we receive all these titles in English. So I would never have known that is an issue, and it is an issue. However, you mentioned something about AJ and doctor formularies or forms that you need to fill out. If every single office, government or private, starts doing this, changing the forms and the titles, the teachers, if we little by little do it, we don't need a group or a representation. Like I want to mention platforms like Me Too and Remezcla, which are like a very social media active platforms that represent, in a lot of ways, they represent Latinos at large, Latinas at large. However, if we, including these platforms, Me Too, Remezcla, would focus more on, because I don't think we fully understand, at least from my experience, we fully understand a non-binary, because we were not born in that world. And I would love for the world to become non-binary. I think that's the main, make everything non-binary, not starting from the language. Because if I see something and I understand it as normal, or as, I don't want to use normal, as, as common, if I see something and I understand it as common, and then I understand there's ways of calling that in a very inclusive way, instead of learning names and concepts that I cannot associate, because a lot of people have never interacted with somebody non-binary. If it's not young artists or advanced metropolis like New York, LA, San Francisco, outside of those bubbles, because those are bubbles. You go outside anywhere in the United States or further in South America, and you don't see concepts outside of the arts of the artist. So little by little, forms and regular shit starts becoming, oh, this is non-binary, and that's cool because it's a synonym of inclusivity and advancement and a better world. Yeah, I want to learn it, you know, but instead of forcing the language, which is my perspective of these platforms that I mentioned, I don't think Me Too or Remezcla represent my Puerto Rican experience. It does represent my Latino experience in the US, and it's hilarious, and I love their content, and I'm the #1 fan. However, they are not successful in other markets outside of US. So I think their objective, the target audiences are Latinos in the US, Latinas in the US. But I think we need to interact more with the concept and be present with non-binary everything, and then naming that with, I don't know, don't start from the language, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I agree with what Wolf said, that seeing that somebody already uses Latinx already tells you a lot about the person. And I think it's the matter of like being included, being thought of. And I think, like Kelmy said, we need to, as Latinas, Latinx, as humans, accept that non-binary people and trans people exist, and that they are part of our communities, and that they are real, and that they have rights, and that we should be allies to them, and we just need to like respect them. And if somebody wants to be called ella, I will call them ella because that's their fundamental right. And if somebody wants to be called they, them, I will call them they, them, because that is how they want to be talked to. So I do think that sometimes what happens with the conversations around Latinx, Latinas, it's more about how willing people are to accept the realities of others, to accept that it's not black or white, that we don't exist in a world that is just really straightforward. There are many nuances. And I think that if we also think into, oh, but if we change Latines, then we have to change everything. Maybe, because, you know, like maybe, but we don't have to go there yet. Let's just accept it that like somebody wants to be called AA, and we'll go from there. We'll take it from there, you know? Because I think as artists, we know that things change. I mean, all our life, we've been told that Shakespeare was the best writer in the world, and he invented hundreds of words, and we use them nowadays. We use them so often. So I think that, yeah, that is my whole point with this conversation. I'll call my fellow men, women, non-binary, I will call them what they want, because yeah, I'm here for them.
Thank you. Hot take is that we can't go backwards. There is no getting rid of X. There is no getting rid of A. I think that we have been speaking, well, us colonized people have been speaking Spanish now for 400-500 years now. And language is ever evolving. I love Wo's idea. I'm like, yo, let's just use le. Like, why are we just like languages? We're gonna keep mixing up. Estamos mezclado. We're gonna keep mezclando. And so the language should mezcla too. We got Spanglish. We got Spanish and French. I know that, what's it called? I know you probably got some Spanish and Filipino mixes in there. I know that there's some marriage in those two languages as well. And whoa, that's all the same people anyway. But there is no going backwards. Language is going to keep going forward as well. So why are we getting knocked up about like, is this este español puro? No, nobody is. We're going to keep moving forward, everyone. We're going to keep mixing up, and the language is going to keep evolving, and we just got to get on board one little bit at a time.
Totally all for getting on board. I agree with everything GB said. But yeah, I feel like the main thing for me myself is just the same way that we are hoping to, of course, be, included in this conversation with other people generationally and everything. I feel like we just need to focus as well on being patient, and having that compassion with everybody and understanding that, like Regina said, somebody has to actually be open to understanding this. They actually have to be present with you in that moment in order to do so. So the first things first is I say, don't get frustrated with everyone because not everyone is here yet. We are moving forward, but there are people that move a little bit slower. And it is what it is. They're going to learn in their own time, but let's focus on those who are actually present with us, who are willing to do these changes, who are willing to add to the conversation and use other terms and figure it out, because that's exactly what we're going to be doing this whole time, is just figuring it out. If we ourselves can continue to be ourselves and be open, there's going to be more and more people that we're going to catch and find along the way to actually add into this. So, it's not going to happen overnight, but it is going to happen because we are the people who are making it happen. So there's always going to be that positive note on that, regardless of who's jumping on or not. So it comes down to it, like Kelmi said, we can't force it upon everybody in this moment, but eventually we're going to be the generation literally leading everyone below us. So as long as we enforce our own standard with it, it's only going to trickle down from there. So we don't actually have to, force it on the older generations. They are all going to, go eventually. So we're going to be those people in that place. And it is what it is. We got to set our own standard. And pa'lante, siempre pa'lante. That's it.
I think just as long as we're, having this conversation, I think it's just important to keep building on language, just as like we keep building on the LGBTQIA spectrum. I mean, just in the past 10 years, we've had more and more inclusivity and more research done to show that there is a spectrum in gender. And I think as long as that's happening, and as long as we're learning more about the human brain and how it functions and how we identify as ourselves, then we need to keep doing the same with our language and just keep building on it too.
Yeah, I'm 100% on board with doing and saying whatever is going to make people feel, number one, comfortable, and number two, respected. Like, that's really the most important thing. I know that I don't necessarily speak for everyone, but I'm definitely personally more worried about things like toxic masculinity than if someone accidentally calls me he. And that's just my own personal perspective and lived experience. And then I'm also spending significantly more time in my life trying to unpack what it is to have had Spain screw over your ancestors, both in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean. So what that means. So I really can't spend too much time worrying about specific language,
And I'd like to offer, just for closing remarks, there's a queer scholar, Gloria Ansaldúa, who has written about the term nepantla, a Nahuatl word that captures the concept of being caught between worlds. She argues that the complex racial history of Latin America has created a unique mindset, a refusal to conform to racial and social binaries, and an identity based more on the mixing of cultures than on any other solid, static case designation. Latinx is entirely in keeping with this tradition of mestizaje, the mezcla. And Dr. Luisa Perez Ortiz says, I am not sure being in the dictionary is a benchmark we can aspire to when we are defining categories that describe us, identify us. For her and many other self-identified Latinx people, the ability to select the terms we want to identify as is more important than a simple dictionary inclusion. So those are my closing remarks. And remember, like what Kelmi said, just if you're not sure how to call someone, just ask and make sure you are clear about the way you want to be addressed and represented. Just speak out.
Yeah, well, my closing statement is I just wanted to say I'm so grateful to have been here for this conversation. It was so enlightening. And like I said, I love this conversation because it's really just again, like Regina said, how much we are willing to work to include other people. And I'm so grateful to be among people who are willing to work.
Yeah, I just first and foremost, I want to thank you guys. You guys have fabulous minds and hearts and words. And I feel very lucky to be part of something as simple as a Zoom conversation about something like this.
Super quick. RESPCT, and I wanted to say next time bring it hard questions because we are all agreeing here and I love it, but I want hard controversial questions so we can create community conversation and disrupt the culture. That's
Yes, Kelmy, on that note, thank you for that. I think we need to do another one on the history of the word Latino itself, Latin American, right? Where does that come from? I think we need to, and if you viewer have something to say, we have the comments. We'll also be posting the links that helped us build this conversation, so you can read those articles. So yeah, and if you feel like I have something to say, we'll have you next time. So here we go.
Yeah, guys, that's what I'm talking about. And I do think that you all brought, even though yes, we do macro agree, I do think we micro have different perspectives on how to skin the cat. And Jasmine, did you have one more thing you wanted to say?
I was just gonna make a joke that next week the discussion is gonna be whose rice is best.
See, that's the real issues that we're hoping to tackle with this endeavor. Like, this was just the primer for the rice question. Thanks for that. All right, you guys, with that being said, thank you all so much. I learned a ton. I'm sure you did too. Thanks for joining us, and salud. Cheers your camera, even if you don't have anything. Salud, dinero y amor. Thank you guys so much, and we are done.